So we have Dr. Gemma Tetlow from the Institute of Government giving kind of a policy impact analysis of theme 4. Thank you, Gemma.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, back at Warwick yet again. I did my undergraduate and master's here, so it's always a pleasure to come back. So I was asked to give a bit of a policy view and reflection on the findings from theme 4 of CAGE's research programme over the last 5 to 10 years. And I mean, I think the questions that CAGE set out in this theme have never been more relevant, and actually in many ways probably showed a great deal of foresight when I imagine the CAGE research programme was being drawn up before 2015 to predict quite how important the relationship between globalisation, voter preferences and the sorts of policies that governments in the Western world would adopt, just how important that would be. I mean, I think if I remember my own views sort of around the 2015 election, I felt that we had a very centrist political environment. I couldn't believe there would ever be a majority government that would be running on a very extreme platform. And I think the last few years has probably proved me totally wrong. So it's very welcome that CAGE has been doing this work to understand the links between globalisation, voter preferences and policies. And it's also, I think, very good to see drawing together the links between political science, political economy and economics, because there are clearly very important two-way relationships between all of these things. So economics clearly affects politics. Globalisation is widely thought to be beneficial to economies, but the benefits of globalisation are clearly not equally shared, and that has impacted on political views. We've also seen a period of very weak economic growth since the financial crisis. There is lots of debate to be had about why that has happened, but I think undoubtedly that has also impacted on the political debate and feelings of people being left behind and left out. And debates about how much that is related to inequality or growing inequality in different countries. It's also the case that politics affects economics. Brexit in the UK, I think, is largely a political debate, and I'll come back to this in a second, but clearly does have economic implications, and we're still yet to know exactly what those are going to be, but depending on the form of Brexit and the form of the UK's future trading relationships, could have huge implications for the UK economy in future. Similarly, we're seeing global trade wars, quite politically driven, having quite a large impact on the global economy at the moment. And finally, I think it's nice that this theme of CAGE looks at the importance of institutions and policies in mitigating and managing some of these globalisation trends and determining whether or not people get a good deal out of globalisation or not. For the rest of my overview, I want to just pick out some of the sort of themes that came out of the CAGE work that sort of struck me as having particularly interesting implications for policymakers these days, and pose a few questions that occurred to me looking at some of the CAGE papers in this theme, perhaps for future work for CAGE, or perhaps things that have already been answered, but I'm not aware of the answer, so always good to learn. So the first set of issues, which is really what David has just been presenting on, is CAGE's look at the relationship between globalisation, voter preferences, and institutions and policies. I think Charlotte Cavallier's work, which Vera mentioned, has some very interesting implications and I think lessons for policymakers in the UK and no doubt elsewhere. So Charlotte's work looked at what happened when there was an Austrian policy required by the EU to open up social housing to immigrants, and the impact that that had on negative feeling towards immigrants, particularly in areas where there was a higher share of immigrants. And so a sense among voters that this was a zero-sum game, that if an immigrant got some social housing, that meant that I couldn't get it instead. To me, that rings very true for the sort of debate we had in the UK before and after the referendum on EU membership, where there was definitely a sense that lack of access to public services, the fact I couldn't get a GP appointment, for example, was tied to the high rates of immigration from the EU, particularly after the Eastern accession countries came in. And politicians in this country certainly, I think, found it very easy to basically exploit that, blaming immigrants for that policy. Economic evidence is pretty clear that immigration is generally good for economies and has a positive boost to public finances overall. But it was quite easy for politicians to latch on to that inherent reaction of voters that immigrants are taking away from my public services, and it was easier to let them think that than to actually own up to the fact that politicians had, in some sense, made a choice not to use those higher taxes paid by immigrants to boost public services, and instead had simply allowed public service funding to decline over the period after the financial crisis. So I think Charlotte's work is interesting because it clearly, I think that is what politicians in the UK did, and yet Charlotte's work suggests that the risk of doing that is that it allows the rise of populist right-wing parties who latch on to that anti-immigrant feeling and can then actually undermine support for more centrist parties in the end. David's work on preferences for redistribution is also very interesting. He's sort of outlined that, so I won't say too much more about that. But one thing that did occur to me reading or looking at the results that you presented was a question about whether the relationships that you talked about, whether it matters what the voting system is that you have. And in particular, wondering whether the first past the post system in the UK, we know that leads to a lot more strategic voting. And so whether the relationship between voter preferences, voting behaviour, and then policies is different in a country like the UK than it might be in a country with proportional representation, for example. I also wonder whether the last 3 years since Brexit provide a useful experiment in understanding how voters' preferences are formed, because polls before the referendum suggest that Europe and the UK membership of Europe really wasn't something that most voters cared about at all. After 3 years of non-stop media and parliamentary debate about Europe, it's now one of the top things on voters' minds. And so I wonder if that gives us a useful experiment in how you can form voters' preferences on a subject that most people didn't care anything about, simply by focusing on it a lot. And finally, around this question of how politicians, the sort of blame placed on migrants, Charlotte's work raised for me a question about the importance of accountability and the level of accountability. And in particular for the UK, I think it was relatively easier as a member of the EU to blame problems at home on immigration policy that was set by the EU and sort of to duck any form of accountability for the UK government for policies that were made elsewhere. And I wonder whether that has implications for how we structure our political institutions and where we put accountability at a national or subnational level to boost those sorts of outcomes. The second set of issues that this theme picks up on is a couple of the two sort of key trends that we've seen in fiscal policy since the financial crisis. The first was consolidation, and the second one was the rise of independent fiscal institutions, the OBR in the UK and others elsewhere in Europe. So Lucy Barnes and Tim Hicks's work interestingly highlights the fact that governments around Europe weren't punished in the way you might have expected them to be for quite serious fiscal consolidation after the financial crisis. I think that's certainly true in the UK. I think it would be interesting to see what happens in the next phase of fiscal policy, because I think we're already starting to see in the UK the public are not so motivated now by fiscal restraint. Borrowing is no longer at 10% as it was immediately after the financial crisis. We're obviously seeing the leadership candidates for the Tory party starting to promise tax cuts, spending increases, and talk about the fact that we no longer need to get borrowing down any further. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the relationship between fiscal prudence and voting behaviour evolves in this next phase, where perhaps the public are no longer quite so bought into the idea that fiscal consolidation is needed. Secondly, so Vera and Christina Schneider's work showing that fiscal transparency can lead to some slightly unfortunate and perverse outcomes in the way that politicians respond. So your work points out particularly to the fact that politicians, rather than funding popular spending promises by extra borrowing, they've diverted money from capital spending, which the public might not notice quickly, through to current spending as a way of doing that instead in an environment where you have more fiscal transparency. I mean, I'd add a couple of other things that the coalition and Conservative government in this country have done. So it's quite noticeable that, given that the OBR was in existence and commenting on the headline measures for borrowing, there were two things that George Osborne tended to do. One was to sort of pencil in slightly implausible paths for spending on public services. So you could say that borrowing was coming down, but it implied rather implausibly low levels of spending on things like health and social care and education. The other tendency was to implement policies, particularly on the tax side, that raised money in the short term, but either cost money or raised far less in the longer term. And so I think one interesting question, there have obviously been lots of benefits to greater fiscal transparency. Could we do any more to sort of mitigate some of those slightly unintended consequences that have happened over the last few years? And the final thing that I do think is interesting out of all of this work is thinking not just about the sort of the headline levels of tax and spend, but the details of policy and how that really matters for the sorts of outcomes that we get. And I mean, Vera touched on some of the work that she's done with Thomas Plumper, so looking at the trend that there has been as globalisation has sort of made it harder for governments to tax capital, the trend towards shifting towards taxing labour instead as a way of maintaining the funding needed for the welfare state. That's clearly been very interesting, and also her work looking at the fact that more welfare spending isn't always better in terms of some of the social and health outcomes that we might be interested in. A couple of questions for me that come out of that, looking at the debates that are going on here. In terms of the shift of taxation from capital to labour, I would be interested to know whether this shift can continue to happen and whether it continues to be sustainable. My sense is that there is a growing discontent among the population, certainly in the UK, about the multinational companies and capital that are perceived as paying less than their fair share of tax, and that is making it hard for governments in this country to make the case for higher levels of tax to be charged on other people. And that, if you think about the long-term fiscal pressures that the UK and other governments face, we need to find ways of funding public services and pensions for our ageing population. If it's very hard to make the case that workers and residents of the UK should pay more of their income in tax for those services because there is a perception that multinational companies, mobile international capital, isn't paying its fair share, I wonder whether we are coming to the limits of this shift from taxing capital over to taxing labour. And that then leads us to the obvious question of how much further can we go in coordinating internationally to try and tax mobile capital through the sort of the OECD programmes to try and set up a global international tax system that would allow us to tax those things without worrying that all of that capital will simply flee the UK's shores and go elsewhere. So I think there are lots of really interesting answers from Cage's work over the last 5 years for policymakers, and I hope that they will take note. I also think there is still plenty to be done in this area to understand and to think about how we can achieve sort of the best outcomes for the Western democracies in what is quite a challenging, globalising world. And I just hope the Cage will carry on working on this. So thank you very much.